Tonight I wanted to spend a few moments addressing recent events in the nation of Venezuela, but before I do, I want to take the opportunity to congratulate the presiding officer, my colleague from the great state of Florida, who a few moments ago, I believe, gave his first speech on the floor of the Senate, and did part of it in Spanish and did it very well, and spoke about the important issues of Puerto Rico, and his leadership here on that's going to be critical. It's an issue I know he knows very well from his time as the governor of our state. And so, and I know this is another cause that he cares about, and he took leadership on it as the governor of the state of Florida, and as recently as 2 nights ago, was with me and some others. Together, we met with the President of the United States to talk about what's happening in Venezuela. The most important answer that we have to have to the American people is, why should it matter to us? Why should America even be involved in this? Beyond expressing an opinion or sending a letter or even a vote at an international organism, why should America lead, and why should America be so intricately involved in something going on in another country? And that's always a valid question. It's the most important question we have to consistently answer and not take for granted. I think we don't do that enough anymore in American foreign policy. And it has allowed some to argue that perhaps the United States gets too engaged around the world. We are a nation that should always stand for our principles, and we should defend them, and we should stand with those around the world who share the principles of human liberty and dignity and freedom and respect for human rights. But when the United States gets deeply involved in something in another country, it must also be in our national interest. And so the only reason why being involved on the issues that are going on in Venezuela could be justified to the men and women of this nation for whom we work is to prove to them and argue to them and convince them that what is happening there is not just about Venezuela, but it is in the national interest of the United States. Before I can do that, I have to kind of lay out the history of what brings us to this point. And I won't go into great detail because the time does not permit it. But Venezuela has a constitution. In fact, it has a constitution that was put in place during the rule of Hugo Chavez, someone who I was certainly not a fan of, and who was not a fan of the United States. But under that Constitution, there was a parliamentary body, the National Assembly, and there was a presidency, and there was a Supreme Court. And what happened a few years ago is that when Chavez dies and Nicolás Maduro, the current dictator of the country, takes over, he has to stand for election. And before he stood for election, there was an election to the National Assembly. And the party that was Hugo Chávez's party and now Maduro's party was trounced. They lost badly. They didn't just lose the National Assembly, they lost governor seats across the country. And Maduro realized that his party and he himself could not survive in a truly democratic system. And so what he did is he canceled the National Assembly. First, he just started ignoring them. He stopped following their orders. They'd pass a bill and he just wouldn't implement it, just completely ignore it, as if they didn't exist. And then he replaced the Supreme Court with hand-picked people that would do what he wanted to do. So the equivalent would be if the President of the United States decided that no matter what law we passed, even if we overrode a veto, he just wouldn't implement it. He just refused to do it. And then at some point, he actually tried to create an alternative to the National Assembly. He created out of thin air this thing called the Constituent Assembly, which is an idea he got from the Cubans and from communist countries, and gave them extraordinary powers to do all sorts of things. And one of the things that Constituent Assembly did is they created an election late last spring. Now, people would say Maduro stood for election and he won, theoretically, at least that's their argument, but it wasn't. You can have an election and it not be a real election. For example, every one of the media outlets in the country is controlled by the government. All of them have to run by law. They're mandated to provide what they call network coverage across the board anytime he speaks to the nation. The opposition party doesn't have that same opportunity. He manipulated vote tallies, and they are able to go in and make sure votes are counted in a certain way. They control votes through the food program. 42% of the people in Venezuela depend on a food program run by the government. To have that food program, you have to have an identification card. When you go vote, that same identification card doesn't just register whether you voted or not, they know who you voted for. They know who you voted for. And so if you didn't show up to vote and you didn't vote for who they wanted you to vote for, meaning Maduro, you got cut off from your food program. And if you had to choose between voting for someone you didn't like and not feeding your family, you're going to vote for someone you didn't like. But despite all that, the turnouts were abysmally low. The images that came out, there was like 2 people in line in some cases. Sometimes they caught the same 5 people making the line over and over again. It wasn't a real election. By the way, he legally disqualified every credible opponent he could have possibly had. And because it was a fake election, the opposition boycotted it. So he didn't even have real opposition. So he wins this fake election, and then comes January, he tries to be sworn in, and he does through this ceremony, but it's not legitimate. It would be the same as if the President of the United States announced that he's calling new elections not in 2020, we're going to have them in April of this year. And if he wins, he's going to get to serve 6 years instead of 4. And everybody here would say, well, that's not the Constitution. It's not a constitutional election. That's what they did. So it's not a real election. And under the Constitution of Venezuela, because that was not legitimate, you have a vacancy in the office of the presidency. And under the Constitution of Venezuela, similar to ours, when there was a vacancy in the presidency, and by virtue of that, the vice presidency, because it was elected alongside, the president of the country becomes the equivalent of our Speaker of the House. The same line of succession we have here. Becomes the president of the National Assembly. And the president of the National Assembly assumes that charge as interim president, and within 45 days has to call valid constitutional elections. And that's what happened yesterday. The valid president of the National Assembly assumed the responsibility of interim president. And now within the next 45 days, he will have to schedule and call for elections. Now, the United States responded to that by stating the obvious. This is not constitutional. It's not legitimate. We don't recognize this fake president. We recognize your Constitution and the president that the Constitution says is in place, this interim president. This is not a guy who's trying to be president himself for 6 years. This is not a fight between 2 political parties, not some civil war like we see in other parts of the world between 2 competing bands. This is basically the person who has been elected, the president of the National Assembly, assuming an interim position, who is now a caretaker to guide the country back towards constitutional democracy. And the United States recognized it. And it is stunning to see some of the reporting on this here and around the world, that he basically proclaimed himself the president. No, he just assumed his constitutional responsibility. That the United States did something unusual in recognizing him. Number one, it's not unusual, it's the Constitution of Venezuela. And number two, it wasn't just the United States. We were immediately joined by 11 countries in the region. That number is now up to 16. In the Western Hemisphere, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Honduras, Guatemala, all of them lined up and reflected the exact same position that the United States has taken on this issue. So did France. Apparently, so did the United Kingdom today, and Albania, and Kosovo, and a growing number of countries. Even the European Union says Maduro's illegitimate. They haven't gone as far as to recognize the interim president as the interim president, but they have said he's illegitimate and that the National Assembly is legitimate. So it's not unusual. It happens to be the global norm. Who disagrees with us on this other than Maduro? Cuba, Turkey, Russia, Iran, Egypt, apparently. What do they have in common? Think about it. These are not democracies, and they have their own interests here at heart. Some might ask, well, how does this guy hold on to power if he's so terrible? Well, number one, he controls access to food. And I can tell you, if you control access to food and medicine, and you threaten people with hunger, you'll have a lot of control. The other thing he's done is he uses migration as a relief valve. It's a very Cuban regime type tactic. It is estimated that over 2.3 million people, basically 1 out of 12 Venezuelans, have left the country since 2015. Think about that. 1/12 of the population has abandoned the country, leaving behind, in many cases, children on their own, leaving behind catastrophe. And so the ability to drive out opponents and people for whom life has become too miserable is a relief valve. The other is just sheer repression. They put people in jail, they kill people, the people die in custody, they shoot them in the streets. That's pretty effective too sometimes. The second thing that keeps them in power is the assistance of the Cuban regime. And every time I mention that, people think, well, you're just obsessed with Cuba, you're from Miami, you're Cuban American. The Cubans, when it comes to intelligence and repression, punch way above their weight. They are experts at repression. And that is what they basically assist them with. Do you know the Cubans basically run the security apparatus of Venezuela? The personal security of Maduro are Cubans, which tells you a lot about how much trust he has in his countrymen. The Cubans provide them basically all of their intelligence collection and the capacity to collect intelligence. They've trained their National Guard on crowd control. By the way, none of this is free. These are not free services. This is a country that is poor and low on resources. The Cubans are probably pulling in $1 billion a year for these services they provide. The other thing people keep mentioning that keeps them in power is the loyalty of military officers. And I know you'll see the picture of all these guys in a country, by the way, where people are starving. Every single one of these military guys is overweight. Somehow, in a starving country, these people are gaining weight. And they have these fancy uniforms on. But let me tell you, these folks are not truly loyal to Maduro. I saw that picture today, and I can tell you for a fact that more than half of the people in that picture at some point in time have expressed serious doubts about Maduro. But they are really limited in what they can do right now. Why? First of all, because all of them every single one of them is compromised. Their loyalty is not ideological and it's not personal. It is bought, it is paid for. Because every single one of them has access to lucrative corruption opportunities. Some of them have been given the opportunity to raid Venezuela's national oil company. And they've made millions, hundreds of millions of dollars by running that company into the ground. Some of them have been given the distribution of consumer goods, watches and phones and consumer articles. They give them these things, so you guys go out and sell them in the black market in the street and you take your cut. Others have been allowed to skim off that food program I mentioned that feeds 42% of the people. The military officers get first dibs at some percentage of it, and they get to sell food directly for a profit. Some are participating in currency manipulation. It sounds a lot like an organized crime ring, like one of these old-style mafia families where one guy ran the loan sharking racket, the other guy had the gambling, the other guy had the prostitution, the other guy did the bank heists. That's what this is. These people are loyal because Maduro allows them corruption opportunities. They're also loyal, by the way, because the Cubans are spying on them. The Cuban intelligence agencies quickly pick up on any of these military officers that are being disloyal or expressing doubts, and those guys are arrested. There has been a massive purge of Venezuelan military officers over the last 2 years. I'm talking about dozens of high-ranking military officials either removed from their positions or arrested and are in jail. And it wasn't for corruption, believe me. It was because the Cubans caught them and reported them, and they were wrapped up. And everybody else is watching that and saying, it ain't going to happen to me. That's not really loyalty, that's fear. You could see it in their eyes today. And by the way, they resent the Cubans, these military officers. Imagine for a moment, this is your country, and here comes this smaller country, and their guys run everything and tell you what to do and spy on you and pit you against each other. But they better be careful about expressing that resentment because the Cubans are listening, and they'll report you. Despite all this, all is not good for the Venezuelan regime. In fact, it's gotten harder and harder every day. Because what's happened with the sanctions that have been imposed on these individuals, it has cut off their ability to steal money and enjoy corruption. And it's cut off the ability to enjoy the money that they've stolen. They can't travel. They can't buy certain things. They have to hide their money. Some of them have had assets seized here and abroad. And that's created resentment, and that's created anger within the inner circle. And so all these people in the inner circle are now upset because they're not making as much money off corruption as they used to make. And they start saying to themselves, maybe we got to get rid of Maduro and get a new godfather or mafia head here. And Maduro finds out about it and he eliminates them. And so the circle gets smaller, which actually works to his benefit because with shrinking resources, the less mouths you have to feed with corruption, the better. There's a real good example of it. There's a guy named Diosdado Cabello who ostensibly is now the president of this fake Constituent Assembly. He happens to be a drug lord, deeply involved in narco trafficking. That's, I guess, his part of the corruption deal. That's his take. That's the business line he's been given. But he also wants to be president. He wants to be president, not Maduro. Interestingly enough, this guy Cabello, when Chavez was removed in a coup that lasted just a couple days, 12, 14 years ago, Cabello swore in as president of Venezuela because there was a vacancy using the exact same provision of the Constitution that they now claim is illegitimate. But here's this guy Cabello, who's a drug dealer, a drug lord, a thug, but he wants to be president. He'll never be elected president of Venezuela in a normal election, in a legitimate election. So what's his path to being elected, to becoming president? Well, the first is this Constituent Assembly he's put in charge of. This new thing they created outside the Constitution is so powerful that it has the power to remove Maduro. They could remove Maduro. And this guy hears the whispers. Believe me, these guys are not blind to what's happening. They can see the country's in disarray, the economy's collapsing, there isn't enough money to steal for all of them anymore. And there are people saying to him, hey, why don't you move on this guy? Because this guy's never going to fix this place. And he's thinking about it, and he's thought about it. But he knows the only way he'll ever be president is if he can preserve the outlines of this regime and just get rid of the Godfather and proclaim himself the Godfather, the head of this new criminal syndicate. Or he could just wait till 2024 and run in a rigged election, again, set up under the confines of this regime. So even if he doesn't like Maduro, it's to his benefit that the guy stays there until he's ready to make his move on him, or until 2024, when he could run under this rigged-up system. What else is wrong with Venezuela is they're deeply in debt. They have serious problems. These are the things he's hearing about. They owe China about $18 billion, which they don't have the money to pay. They owe Russia about $3 or $4 billion. You know how they're paying that right now? With oil. They are sending oil to China and to Russia with pennies on the dollar. That's what they're making, because they don't have cash. So they're bartering it instead, paying their debts off in oil. Now, I know you've seen the public pronouncements. The Chinese just want to get paid. They're owed $18 billion, and they want to get paid, and they want to make sure that Maduro is in power, or whoever is in power is someone who's going to pay him the $18 billion. But the Russians want to get paid too. Neither one of them believes Maduro is a great leader or happy with him. They just don't know what's going to come after, and they're afraid that whatever comes after is going to say, we don't really owe you this money, it's not legitimate, because it wasn't approved by the National Assembly. And so they'd rather have this guy in place unless it's going to be someone else just like him. But they're not happy. The corruption in the national oil company is so horrifying that even the Chinese and the Russians don't like it. That's how bad it is. And that's got to be a pretty high standard. Then there's the mismanagement. They've destroyed this company. Its production has collapsed. I mean, it's not run by oil people. It's run by generals that don't know anything about the business. They've run it into the ground. And they've missed payments. Remember, they're supposed to be delivering oil for payment. They've missed deliveries to the Chinese and to the Russians. They're not happy about it, but what are they going to do? At least they're getting paid something. Russia has another interest, by the way, which leads me now to why we should care about it. First and foremost, I can make to you a very compelling argument, I believe. That's what's happening in Venezuela is a national interest threat to the United States and even potentially a national security one. Let me just start with this one. Maduro has repeatedly and openly invited the Russians to establish both a naval and an air base in Venezuela. He basically said, here's the land, we'll build it for you, we want you to have your airplanes, we want you to have your naval ships stationed here. Now, most of us serving here, with some exceptions, have never served in Congress, and many people around do not remember a time when foreign military was stationed, an adversary was stationed in our own hemisphere. But that's what Maduro's inviting him to do. Why does Maduro want it? Because he thinks that acts as insurance against ever having an invasion or whatever he thinks is going to happen. Why does Russia want it? They want it because it's leverage against us. They don't like how close we are to them in Europe with our allies in NATO, so this gives them an opportunity to have the equivalent of it in our own hemisphere. And so if you think that having Vladimir Putin is a good thing, having him in our hemisphere, stationed with his military here, is a good thing, well, then I suppose what's happening in Venezuela wouldn't bother you. But the enormous majority of Americans do not want Vladimir's military anywhere in our hemisphere. And that's precisely what will happen if Maduro remains in power. That alone is a national security threat to the United States. But there's more. In their own national territory, the Maduro regime hosts a group called the ELN, which is a terrorist narco organization. In fact, last week, the ELN detonated a bomb at the police academy in Colombia and killed 20 people. You know where they're headquartered? Inside Venezuelan territory, and it is from there where they plot these attacks. You know what else Venezuela does with the ELN from within Venezuelan territory? They help them ship cocaine to the United States of America. Now, I can tell you both of those are national security interests to the United States. The first is that drugs are a threat to this country, and anyone who is helping a drug trafficking organization ship it into our country is a threat to us. So if you don't mind or don't care about cocaine being shipped in growing quantities into the United States, then I guess Maduro and Venezuela is not something that will bother you. But if you do not want to see people around that are helping drug organizations ship cocaine into the United States under the protection of a government, meaning they're giving them controlled airspace, they're protecting their shipments into the US and into Europe, if that troubles you, then Maduro's a problem. One of our best partners in fighting drugs in the hemisphere is Colombia. But Colombia, right now, is being overwhelmed. They don't have enough money to dedicate to the anti-drug cause at a time when the cocaine production, the growth of coca, and the production of cocaine, I should say, in Colombia, is at historic levels 3 years running. Where do you think that cocaine is headed? A lot of it's headed to our streets. That will be on top of fentanyl and heroin and all the other problems we have. We are going to have a cocaine crisis in this country because all that cocaine is headed here. Colombia is out there trying to fight against it. But their resources are being drained because they have, at this moment, at least 1 million, probably 1.2, 1.3 million Venezuelan migrants who have had to leave Venezuela and are now in their territory. Listen, if the United States suddenly absorbed 1 million migrants over a 12 to 18-month period, we would struggle to afford what that would entail. Imagine Colombia, whose economy is a fraction of the size of ours. And that means instead of being able to spend money fighting the drug cartels to prevent them from bringing the drugs here, they've had to dedicate resources to the humanitarian costs of housing over 1 million people and growing. It's not just Colombia, by the way, that's being compromised. Ecuador, about 160,000, 170,000 Venezuelan migrants. Peru, 350,000 Venezuelan migrants. These people are not bad. They're not criticizing the migrants. But these governments, these are not big governments. Some of these governments have budgets smaller than most of our states. They cannot afford this, and it is threatening to collapse their public health system, which means you may not just have a humanitarian catastrophe in Venezuela. We may soon have a growing economic catastrophe in Brazil, in Peru, in Ecuador, and in Colombia. Multiple countries in our hemisphere, and geography matters. That would be a terrible thing if it's happening in Africa or halfway around the world. It would directly impact the lives of Americans and our economy and our well-being because of how close it is to our country in multiple ways. And so if you think that having a humanitarian crisis in multiple countries in our hemisphere, including countries aligned with us in the war against drugs, then you should care about what's happening in Venezuela. So what's the road forward now? Because I hope people have been compelled to at least understand that this is about more than just caring about democracy. That's a big part of it. We do, and I'm proud of it. But it's about more than just that. This is in the national interest of the United States. And we should be proud, not just of the bipartisan support in favor of the interim president and of democracy in Venezuela. We should be proud of the job that the National Security Council, the White House, and the State Department have done. Because unlike 25 or 30 years ago, this wasn't some unilateral American action where we went in there telling everybody what to do. This is international organisms like the OAS. Today, the Secretary of State appeared at the OAS personally to argue the American case. And he was joined by 15 other countries who voted on a resolution agreeing with our principles on this, and their principles. The leadership of these countries under the auspices of the Lima Group has been extraordinary. The U.S. is an equal partner to them in this endeavor. But what's going to happen now is Maduro is probably going to, instead of he being the one that arrests the interim president, he's going to say, I'm going to turn over to the courts and let them decide. Well, he controls the courts. These guys are all cronies. They're also corrupt, by the way, sanctioned by the U.S. government. So he could very well move to try to arrest the interim president, Juan Guaido, which is tonight, tomorrow, the next day, although the eyes of the world are upon him, and the consequences for that would be extraordinary and severe. You're already starting to hear them talk about, let's have negotiations. This is a tactic they have now used repeatedly, and they use it because they know we all like negotiations. Everybody, anytime there's an international crisis, why don't we all just sit down and negotiate our way through this? And ideally, that would be the outcome. But he doesn't really want negotiations. He wants a delay tactic. He's done this now multiple times. There were negotiations from the Vatican, and they gave up. Then the former Prime Minister of Spain was involved in some of these negotiations. Those were a total catastrophe. He's just doing this to buy time. Now he's talking about Mexico and Uruguay being the host of a negotiation. I wouldn't be surprised if soon he says, why doesn't Russia come in and be the interlocutor? How about that for a national security threat and a national interest threat? Having Vladimir Putin brokering political agreements in the Western Hemisphere. Putin would love it. He fancies himself a great global leader. And you're going to see him do that, but it's all an effort to buy time. He has no intention of negotiating anything because it buys him time to do what? It buys him time for his fake constituent assembly to change the Constitution towards one-party rule, or even potentially to call new flash elections at some point for a new National Assembly under this fraudulent election system he set up. And to many people, they'll say, oh, they had an election, the opposition lost. But it won't be a real election if the candidate people that could win aren't allowed to run, you're not allowed to advertise, you have no access to the media, they control the ballot box, and they extort people with access to food. At some point, I wouldn't be surprised to see him declare a state of emergency. Maybe go out there and trigger some fake incident false flag where agitators go out and commit violence, and he'll say the protesters are out of control, state of emergency. Why would he do that? So he can paralyze the streets, no one can be out there protesting, and if the opposition tries to leave their homes, now he has a pretext to arrest them. But there really is only one way forward, and that is to do everything we can to strengthen the legitimate interim government, and that began today. The interim president, his first request to us for humanitarian aid to help bring food and medicine and medical supplies to the people inside Venezuela. The Secretary of State of the United States immediately announced that as an initial step, we are going to provide immediately $20 million. I know they're working through how to deliver that into Venezuela and how to position that so the Venezuelan people have access to it. This is on top of and apart from the aid we're already providing the migrants in Colombia and in other places. That's a good first step. On day one on the job, the interim president, Juan Guaido, made a request of the international community, and America immediately stepped forward, and I believe very shortly, in a matter of days, there will be significant humanitarian aid, food and medicine, awaiting the people of Venezuela, either within their own territory and distributed through the Red Cross or some other non-governmental organization, or just across the border where they can access it. We have to continue to make clear to the elites in that country that there is no future for Maduro, that there is no way that he can hold on, and they need to begin thinking about who their loyalty should be to. The Constitution they swore an allegiance to, the people they live among, or some guy whose future is about to come to an end. I think it's important that the National Guard know that not only should they not repress the people, but they'll be held accountable if they do. And ultimately, I believe this deeply. I know that the generals and all the guys at the press conference with the fancy uniforms have sworn allegiance, although you notice how nervous they were. But I can tell you the rank and file fighters do not. You know why? Because the rank and file soldier and the mid-level officer in the Venezuelan military, they don't have corruption deals. They're going just as hungry as everybody else. They have massive rates of desertion, people just abandoning posts. And when you saw the images yesterday of the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, you know that many of those soldiers had mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and loved ones and wives and children in that crowd. And you know who else knows that? The military brass. And I know for a fact that they have significant doubts. In fact, they probably do not even believe that if they ordered the military to act against their own people, that the military would. Because there's no way that these rank-and-file soldiers are going to shoot on their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and other loved ones. So we need to step forward and continue with the humanitarian aid. We need to help use the leadership of the United States to put together reconstruction aid. And we need to help the interim president with whatever he needs to be able to carry out a legitimate, free and fair and internationally supervised election, which he should call for in the next 45 days. This is the path forward. It's in our national interest. It's the right thing to do. It reflects our values, but it also reflects our interests as a nation. And that's why this matters. That's why we should care. This is not halfway around the world. This is in our own hemisphere, just a few hours flight away. And it impacts more than just one country. It impacts an entire hemisphere. And I'll close with this. There's been a lot of criticism historically over the U.S. role in the Western Hemisphere. During the Cold War, the criticism was that we were supporting right-wing dictators fighting off communism, that we were involved in coups, and that we had a heavy hand and got in and imposed ourselves. Then we went the total opposite, and for many, many years, in fact, up until very recently, no one even talked about the Western Hemisphere. And to the extent we did, it was about migration and drugs. It was almost, frankly, a complete abandonment of the portfolio. What you're seeing now is the potential birth of a new Latin America, a new Western Hemisphere, one in which the United States is an important partner, but not a unilateral actor. When you see 16 countries in this hemisphere come together with the economic and diplomatic weight of Peru and Chile and Colombia and Argentina and Brazil, when you see the OAS come alive after years of, frankly, not playing them. When's the last time any of us here even discussed any of the things happening at the OAS? You start to see the beginning of not just a way to confront this crisis in Venezuela, but of a hemispheric partnership whose impetus may have been this crisis, but creates a path forward that's in our national interest. Imagine if, in fact, the democracies and free people of this region came together not just to tackle dictatorships, but to tackle drugs, to tackle the root cause of migration. Imagine a hemispheric 16, 18 regional nation response to what's happening in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala that's causing these people to undertake this dangerous journey with their children in many cases. Imagine if it wasn't just the United States, but us working in partnership with all these other countries to tackle these hemispheric challenges. I'll tell you, that's in our national interest. And not only is this an opportunity to do the right thing in Venezuela, it's an opportunity to give the start to a new hemispheric reality, a new Latin American reality that serves the national interests of this country and allows us to live in a hemisphere that is free and prosperous, where people do not have to abandon their homelands, where people can stay in their countries if they so choose and raise their families and not have to undertake dangerous journeys to other countries for fear of their lives. But we have to start somewhere. And I can think of no better place to start than on behalf of the people of Venezuela, who have suffered terribly for far too long under a dictatorial, corrupt regime who has tortured their children and murdered their fathers and mothers and denied a once prosperous country the future they deserve.